Hello everybody, welcome back to Polymath. This is actually the second episode of Polymath Bites, which is this sort of sub-series that I'm running on this channel, where instead of having really big 1 hour to 2 episodes, we just have like a 20-minute episode. And that way it still provides some information, not as much obviously, but still provides enough information to get a useful point across while being a lot more accessible. And I actually have another series on my channel called An Objective Guide to Political Ideologies, where we look at things like liberalism and capitalism and socialism, communism, anarchism, and we do so from a massive multidisciplinary perspective. We draw together lots of different information. We look at these ideologies in a really systematic, thorough way. And that's great, and I love doing that, but all these episodes are really, really long, and some get over 2 hours. So what I wanted to do was just remake a couple of these episodes, or a few of these episodes, maybe all of them, I haven't decided yet, but just do so in a more accessible fashion. And we're starting with what actually is liberalism. And that's a really, really important starting point. I'm going to make that clear by the end of this episode, but it's really, liberalism as an ideology is so vastly important. It's so history defining. It's something which has had such a massive influence on the human condition that in order to discuss politics at all, as like a basic starting point, we really need to start here. So what is liberalism? So liberalism is not the same as being a liberal. So in contemporary Western parlance, being a liberal means having progressive left-wing views. And more information on what left-wing actually means is in episode 26, or episode 8 if you want a longer version of that. But it's not the same thing as being a liberal. And I'm going to ask you to just forget about that for now, because they're just not the same at all. It's because there's no scientific, there's no like taxonomy. It's not the same as like the natural sciences, where there are like specific words for different phenomena and there's no fuzziness in how words are used. It's not the same thing. So we get these concepts, liberal and liberalism, they come from the same root word, they're really, really different things, so just ignore that for now. So what actually is liberalism? Is I mean a key thing here. Liberalism is a socio-political philosophy. So it's a philosophy, it's a belief system. It's not a political ideology per se. And I talk about what defines an ideology in episode 9 of Polymath, but it is a philosophy. And it's basically a philosophy on the nature of politics and the nature of society and what is good in both of these things. So liberalism is essentially a belief system on what makes a good civilization. What's the point of society and politics? What are we aiming towards? And liberalism says that a good society, a good civilization, is a society where you have a free and equal association of individuals. Now, that leaves you a lot of wiggle room. What does free mean? What does equal mean? What makes you an individual? But the point is, in fact, that wiggle room means there's lots of different interpretations of liberalism. And when we talk about liberals now, in the contemporary Western parlance, what that corresponds to is a specific flavor of liberalism called social liberalism. But there's more on that in episode 9 in Polymath. We're not going to get into it now because we just don't have that much time. So, a free, equal, individual association. We have these three essential elements. And the point is that although there's a lot of wiggle room in how you define these, and historically the way that these have been defined are different from how we might define them now, and in different places across the world they're defined in different ways, and in different sort of takes on liberalism they're defined in different ways. But in liberalism, these three basic elements are seen as good things. Freedom, equality, and individualism are seen as just basically inherently good thing. These are ends. They're not means to an end. They're not ways of achieving some other abstract principle. They're the abstract principle that we want to achieve. And again, this all seems really, really basic. This all seems really, really obvious. And that's because liberalism is now the dominant ideology in Western society, but it's not. And in fact, that's only been a case for a tiny minority in human history. But we're going to get onto more of that later. When I talk about individualism, I don't mean excessive individualism. I don't mean the kind of individualism that we see, which is associated with another flavor of liberalism called neoliberalism, which is more of an which is sort of an economic system as well as a socio-political philosophy. But individualism as kind of used nowadays in the West tends to be a bit pejorative. It tends to be sort of like, individualism nowadays, in the way that many people use the word almost implies a sort of cutting off from your society, a sort of isolation from a local community, and that isn't good. And clearly excessive individualism is a thing. But individualism, as conceptualized by liberalism, is basically the idea that everyone is a unique human being with a unique sense of worth that transcends their social class. Because historically, your worth as a human being was not tied to you as an individual. It was tied to the social class that you belong to. So if you were a peasant or an untouchable or a slave or whatever low status demographic, your inherent worth was less because you weren't conceived as a person with rights and feelings. You were just conceived as a member of a community, and the value, the worth of that community, the status of that community corresponded to your worth. So individualism in the liberalist sense is just a way of conceptualizing human worth and human value. So again, another essential fact, so not again, I haven't said this before, another essential fact with liberalism is that in liberalism, in a liberalist sort of belief system, when we judge what is good, we do so on the basis of reason. We think to ourselves, what outcomes lead to the sort of society, what sort of decisions, what policies would lead to the outcomes we want? What can we logically do to lead to the outcomes we want? So for an example of this is utilitarianism. So when we make a decision, we think about how will this affect the happiness or the harm that this decision inflicts on other people? What decision leads to the greatest happiness for the greatest number? In liberalism, what we don't do is make decisions explicitly based on authority. So we don't say, well, X decision is the right thing to do because this authority, whether that's a state authority, such as a king or a monarch, or whether that's a religious authority, such as a holy book, we don't say, well, decision X must be the right thing to do because this source of authority says it's the right thing to do. In liberalism, we make moral decisions in society and politics based on reason. We think about, independently of sources of authority, what would work. And again, that process of reasoning is often influenced by sources of authority, but the point is that explicitly, it's not the same thing as just obedience to some form of authority. So liberalism, as I said, now dominant in Western society. And as a consequence of these sort of basic principles that we kind of all accept, so whether you're left wing or right wing, unless you're very far left, or rather certain flavors of very far left, because as we talked about in episode 9, there's different kinds of far left that want very radically different things. But unless you're a certain kind of far left, or unless you are far right, you will accept that freedom, equality, and individualism are inherently good things. You might disagree on what that means. So for equality, for example, you might say that political equality is enough and economic inequality is acceptable because everyone has an equality of opportunity, everyone has the same basic rights. You might say in contrast, well actually political equality isn't enough. People need to be more economically equal as well. People need to have the same basic access to the things that they need to live. So food, water, shelter, i.e. money. So when we talk about policies of like redistributive taxations or minimum wages or things like that, or wealth inequality, what that really comes down to philosophically, what people are really debating beneath the surface rhetoric of different economic policies, is what form of equality is desirable in our society. What do you want? However, as a consequence of this basic consensus of freedom, equality, and individualism, there are some basic ideas that we all currently really take for granted right now in the West. There's this basic idea that violence is not inherently good. Violence needs to be justified. The arbitrary exercise of power and force is not a good thing. There needs to be some kind of reason to use power, a reason to use force. Another thing, all people are basically equal. Now, again, equal, a lot of scope in this, but most people will generally say that people are fundamentally equal. Some people are more talented than others, sure. Some people might do better things than others, but when individuals are born, no one is inherently more or less worthy or more or less human or more or less deserving of happiness than others. Another basic principle, the purpose of a state ultimately is to try and help people be happy. And again, people don't really think about this and it sounds a bit wishy-washy, but think about it. States provide, they protect us using armies, they police us using police, they give justice using the law courts, they help people survive with a minimum wage and social security, they try and sort of restrict the worst excesses of the market by things like progressive taxation, where people who are wealthier get taxed a bit more. So all of these things ultimately is to try and increase the standard of living of its citizens. So even though we don't really think of the purpose of a state as to be making us happy, and obviously in practice, many things that states do, many things that governments do, explicitly violate this. There's loads of terrible stuff that even in Western countries governments do. However, in a philosophical level, people accept that the role of a state is to try and provide as good a life as they can for the people within it. And again, different people disagree on how much the state should intervene in people's lives and in the economy in order to enforce that. But that is still, generally speaking, a basic sort of tenet accepted by people. Another basic principle that everyone accepts: people have rights. And people should have inherent human rights. They should have the freedom from things like torture or arbitrary murder. They should be able to have freedom of speech. They should be able to choose their religion. Should is the key word here. The point is, it's not that liberalism is describing the state of a certain society as is. It's describing what should be. It describes what's right. And people nowadays, at least in the West, think that people should have rights. And obviously, in countries outside the West, it's not that that's not the case. It's just that different kind of cultural and geographic regions outside the West accept the tenets of liberalism to different extents. And I kind of talked about that a little bit more in episodes like episode 9, episode 18, episode 20. I've also got interviewed about sort of the state of women's rights in the Middle East and women's treatment in the Middle East, and that's also on my Spotify and YouTube, and I talk about that just a little bit more then. But anyway, in the West, at least, that is a general consensus. Another thing, people should consent to be governed. People have this idea that people shouldn't be forced in a dictatorship. People should have some sort of say in how their country is run. And they shouldn't be under regimes where they're forced to do things. They should have they should consent to be in that state. They should consent to be under that government. So democracy is an example of enforcing that. People consent to the state they're in because they choose what kind of government they have. Another thing, religion and state should be separate entities. The rules of politics, most people believe, and again, for example, in right-wing spheres in America, particularly in the southern USA, this is a little bit different, because if you actually look at the sociological and psychological profile of the southern USA, the beliefs of this region tend to be more in alignment with non-Western cultural regions than Western cultural regions. And you can actually look at that in a sort of graph form in something called the World Values Survey, specifically the cultural map of the world. So if you just Google cultural map of the world, you'll see that the USA, on the cultural map of the world, like it combines the northern and the southern USA, so you don't really see it as starkly. But if you just map the southern USA on that map of the world, you'd see that it's how progressive versus conservative it is in its beliefs align more with certain non-Western countries than with Western countries. But anyway, that's just a tangent, and there's more on that in previous episodes. The point that I'm trying to make is that generally in the West, especially in Western Europe and in places like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, people believe that religion should not have a role in politics. Religion and politics should be kept separate. So we have all these ideals that we sort of take for granted, and that's because of liberalism. These are all the ideals, the norms of liberalism, and we take them for granted, but actually, this is a massive anomaly in human history, because it's only in the past 100 or so years in the West that this has become the sort of dominant, mainstream, generally universally accepted set of beliefs in a society. So for the vast majority of history, when states first formed in the 4th millennium BC, all the way up until the 1700s, liberalism didn't even exist. Like, this package of beliefs, this sociopolitical philosophy, this conception of what was good, was not even a thing. There was a sort of echo of liberalism in ancient Greece, sort of especially centered around Athens in the 5th and the 4th centuries BC, but not really. It wasn't really taken to its logical conclusion, because classical Greece in this era, still kept slaves, was still rigidly hierarchical, still committed war crimes all the time. Essentially, it's just the way that war was conducted at the time. The ideals of liberalism, some of them at least, were formulated, but there wasn't really any kind of culture based on this. The first example of liberalism really becoming a thing in its modern incarnation and sort of becoming a coherent philosophy really was in Western Europe in the 1700s, in this sort of social and political movement called the Enlightenment. And during the Enlightenment, liberalism was not the dominant ideology in society, but it was formulated in its modern sort of coherent form for the first time. And throughout this period in Western historiography called the long 19th century, this period from the French Revolution in 1789 to World War I in 1914, liberalism gradually became the sort of accepted, dominant, mainstream belief system in Western society. And throughout the 20th century, liberalism began to diffuse to other societies as well outside the West, and it began to the actual beliefs, the sort of form of liberalism began to change in the West throughout the 20th century as well. So the beliefs in the early 1900s in the UK, for example, would have been sort of recognizable to us, but still really wildly conservative compared to what's normal in Western society now. But liberalism, again, liberalism has really massive psychological consequences, because once you start seeing people as inherently equal and having rights, and once you start making political and moral decisions based on reason rather than appeals to authority or religion or tradition, it leads to really radical continuing changes. It makes things like slavery and feudalism impossible to justify. It makes things like judicial torture impossible to justify. But later down the line, as you progress in that line of thinking, it also makes things like sexism and racism impossible to justify as well. So civil rights happened in the West in the 1960s so late because liberalism, this new way of thinking, had to become accepted and entrenched first. And the point is that when we look at past societies, when we look at how slavery was universal in society until like the 1800s, on how feudalism and other hierarchies were universal in society, on how sexism and racism were so wildly abundant. I mean, sexism, you might think sexism is bad now, but sexism in the past was just awful, to the point where, for example, in ancient Rome, and I'm about to say something quite disturbing, so this is potential content warning. In ancient Rome, for various periods in ancient Rome, if a woman was raped, the crime was not against the woman, but it was against the male head of her family for damage to his property. So the point is that when we look at past societies and we think to ourselves, how could they be so brutal? How could the Romans crucify people for disobedience? How could knights slaughter peasants by the tens of thousands in the 1500s when they tried to rebel for a higher standard of living in Germany? How could the Aztecs sacrifice people? How could, all this stuff? It's because the socio-political philosophy and the attendant psychology of that, the way that people used to think, was fundamentally different. And again, before people conceptualized sort of the socio-political morality in terms of happiness versus suffering, before people thought about what was good in terms of what harmed the people, they did so in terms of authority versus obedience. So if you think of a utopia right now, you probably think of a world where everyone is happy. But for the vast majority of human history, a utopia was not a world in which everyone was happy. It was a society, rather, in which its people were obedient and obeyed authority blindly. That was seen as the moral good. And that's why violations of authority in state societies in the past, from the 4th millennium BC all the way up until the 1800s, were punished so brutally. So it was why the punishment for any kind of disobedience, any kind of disrespect to authority before Western Europe in the long 19th century was always being tortured to death, because it was seen as this great moral violation. So the major political ideologies that I talk about on this channel really come down to whether they are liberalist or non-liberalist. So it comes down to whether they accept this liberalist philosophy of freedom, equality, and individualism being inherently good things, or whether they don't accept that. Now again, that's a really massive simplification of ideologies, and it's something that is useful to think about, but not a scientific typology of different ideologies. But in terms of this channel, in terms of things like communism, socialism, anarchism, fascism, that is a useful dichotomy to think about. Because the irony and the tragedy of things like socialism and communism is that when they were formulated in the 1800s, and I talk about this much more in episodes 12 and 14 of Polymath, when they were formulated, they were meant to be liberalist. They envisioned a future of, the whole point of these philosophies was to create a world of freedom, equality, and individualism. These philosophies emerged because people felt that the form of capitalism and the form of democracy in Europe in the 1800s was not sufficient to deliver these three aims. The whole point of these philosophies was to create a world in which the burden of suffering was less and wherein people were happier. Now, of course, as we see in socialist and communist states in the 20th century, that didn't happen. And we explore this massive difference, this massive divergence in these philosophies as what they were meant to be and what they actually turned out to be in episode 14. And the final thing to mention is that fascism, in contrast to this, is explicitly anti-liberal. So Goebbels, for example, famously said that they wanted to wipe out history since the Enlightenment. They wanted to bring morality and moral philosophy and political philosophy back to before the Enlightenment, before the changes of liberalism. The goal was to create a society where morality was not construed in terms of happiness versus harm, but was construed in terms of authority and obedience to authority. So, that is Polymath Bites. That is an episode on what is liberalism, an objective guide. I really hope you enjoyed, and I recommend just watching the full episode if you're still interested, which is episode 9. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely day. Take care.